Hey everyone, good evening. Thanks for joining us for another Wednesday night Bible study. You may notice that I'm actually showing my face tonight, and I've not been doing that the past few Wednesday nights. We've just been working with the PowerPoint slides. A few of you have mentioned that you think you might be able to focus and follow along a little bit better if I also have my face in here some. So I'm going to try it this way this week. We're going to see how it goes, and please get back to me and let me know if this is more helpful for you as we study. But just want to have a brief review of what we've been talking about in our class theological themes in the Old Testament before getting into our material for tonight. So last week, we started getting into the Old Testament story by thinking about the theme of redemption. And we talked about what redemption looked like in the patriarchal world of the Old Testament. And essentially, redemption involved reaching out to a wayward or a severely struggling member of the family and bringing them back into the family's good graces, into their protection and their provision, those types of things. And that's really important because outside of the family, there really were no social safety nets in the time of the Old Testament. So it's extremely important. And so, if we think about the Old Testament as a story of redemption, then in the Old Testament, God is reaching out to his people, and he's also reaching out to the world and offering to bring them into his protection and provision and salvation. And this is God redeeming Israel and working ultimately to redeem the world. And those things come to fruition more in the New Testament. But tonight we're going to look at another key theme in the Old Testament that is important for grasping its overall message, and this is the theme of covenant. Covenant is closely connected to redemption from last week. One could say that covenants are the method or the vehicle by which God works to redeem the world. And so, through better understanding covenants, we can more clearly grasp the redemptive story and message of the Old Testament, and we can better understand the God we love and the God we serve. Now, what's on the screen right now is from 2 weeks ago when we talked about getting the lay of the land of the Old Testament. You may remember we talked about the lay of the textual land, the books of the Old Testament, also the physical land, the geography, and where things are on a map, and also the chronological land, where things happened, or when things happened, rather, throughout the Old Testament. But we made most of those chronological benchmarks connected to biblical characters. We had Adam and Noah, Abraham, Moses, and David, and you can see the dates that we associated with them on the screen. Well, if we give Adam and Noah their own categories, then we have five separate characters. And what is significant for tonight is that God makes a covenant involving each one. And so if we trace those covenants, we can pretty clearly trace the story of the Old Testament. So, if covenants are helpful for tracing the redemptive message and story of the Old Testament, then we definitely need to pause and ask, what is a covenant? Well, the closest thing that we really have today is a legal contract. A covenant is a lot like a modern day legal contract. But instead of having the force of law behind it, the covenant is effective in a different way. Basically, in a covenant, two parties make commitments to each other under oath, and the oath is then ratified in a clear and visible way. And the common way to ratify the oath in the ancient world was through animal sacrifice. So basically, a covenant is a binding agreement between two parties. And this is something that can occur between two individuals or between two larger groups of people, like two tribes, or even two entire nations. And so this is how treaties and alliances were made in the ancient Near East, again, on both a small scale but also on a large scale. It all operated through covenants. Now, because there were so many because so many different kinds of people could make covenants, there are also naturally different kinds of covenants. But there are two main kinds, and both of them are helpful for understanding how covenants work in the Old Testament, but particularly the second one. So the first kind of covenant is a treaty between two equal parties. This is called a parity treaty. And the second kind is a treaty between a greater or a stronger party and a lesser and a weaker party. And this is often called a suzerain vassal treaty. Suzerain vassal treaty. And suzerain is the term that refers to the stronger party. Vassal is the term that refers to the weaker party. Now, in the second of these kinds of treaties, the suzerain and the vassal, the language that's used to refer to the two parties was often the language of father and son, or the language of lord and servant. And a suzerain vassal treaty between nations is basically how a larger or more powerful nation related to and had authority over a smaller and less powerful one. And in this type of treaty between nations, the more powerful nation, the suzerain, would take ownership of the weaker nation's land, would take ownership of the vassal's land, but then they would return the land to them as a gift and allow them to have a ruler over them who would answer to or be under the authority of the suzerain. And the suzerain would also offer military protection to the vassal nation if ever they came under attack. But then in return, the vassal nation, the weaker party, they were expected to pay tribute to the suzerain nation. They're expected to pay taxes to them. And also, if that suzerain nation ever got into a military conflict, they could require the vassal nation to come to their assistance. And then also, if at any point the vassal nation, the weaker nation, stopped paying taxes, or if they made a covenant with another suzerain, then the deal was off and the suzerain nation could then respond with some really harsh punishment. And this is the type of thing that the kings of Israel get caught up in books like Kings and Chronicles. They may make a covenant with someone like Assyria or Egypt, which would really upset God because they already have made a covenant with him. But then they would make those nations upset when they stop paying tribute, when they stop paying taxes to them. And so this is something that Israel can get caught up in. Joshua chapter 9 and 10 is a good example that Richter, one of the authors I recommended at the beginning of this class, one that Richter points out of covenants happening in the Old Testament that really captures the idea well. So in Joshua 9 and 10, the Israelites are coming into the promised land, and they've already defeated a couple of cities. And the Gibeonites realize that they cannot defeat the Israelites. And so they strike a suzerain vassal treaty with them, with themselves, with the Gibeonites as the vassal. And they do this with deceit. They make themselves look like poor travelers who live outside the promised land. And so they trick Joshua into agreeing with this covenant. But here's the problem. The Gibeonites were apparently already under a treaty with the rest of the Canaanite nations. And so when the nations learn that they have broken their covenant to make a new covenant with the Israelites, they gather together to attack the Gibeonites, right? This is the punishment coming on them for breaking the covenant. So then the Gibeonites do what any good vassal would do. They appeal to their new suzerain. They appeal to Israel for help. And Israel is bound by the force of the covenant to come to their aid. And so they do. But it does not go well for Israel. And the whole thing, the whole debacle ends up being a lesson to the Israelites not to make these types of important treaties and covenants without consulting the Lord. That was their problem. They did not consult the Lord before they did this, and they were deceived. Now, we mentioned before that covenants were often ratified by animal sacrifice. Now, just as a heads up, what I'm about to describe here is a little bit gross, but something that we know about the ancient Near East was that sometimes the suzerain party would cut the animals that were sacrificed in half and make the vassal party walk between the two halves of the animal. And so obviously this would have been a gory, messy, bloody mess to walk through, and it was a very powerful, very visual reminder of what the vassal was in for if they broke the covenant. And so with that in mind, and again, I know that might sound a little bit disturbing, but with that in mind, I want us to look briefly at God's covenant with Abraham. This is Genesis 15. I'm going to start reading in verse 7, and just pay attention to what is going on here. And he, the Lord, said to Abram, I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. But he said, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? He said to him, Bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he brought him all these, cut them in half, and laid each half over against the other. But he did not cut the birds in half. And then skipping down to verse 17. When the sun had gone down, and it was dark, behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, "To your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates." And then the uh, the conversation continues there. The Lord continues speaking to Abraham. But we see there that Abram is instructed to cut the animals in half, and he is clearly the inferior or the vassal party here. He is the vassal in this covenant with God. And yet, in this instance, who is it that passes between the two halves? It's not Abram. It's not the vassal. It's the superior party. It's the suzerain in the form of that fire pot and the flaming torch. In the world of the ancient Near East, there is no stronger way for God to confirm to Abram that God will give this land to him. The suzerain has just experienced that strong visual reminder that the vassal is supposed to experience. And so, like we talked about last week, we're once again seeing God surprise the people he interacts with by upending what was expected in their time and place. So I'd like us to look at the different parts, the different pieces that commonly went into ancient Near Eastern covenants. And then we'll take a look at the law of Moses and see how these things can help us better understand God's covenant with Israel. And the law of Moses specifically is important because this covenant is going to drive so much of the Old Testament story and its message. But international suzerain and vassal covenants, they were commonplace in the ancient Near East. And because of that, we have discovered ancient documents that outline these covenants and what all often went into them. And we talked about some of this already with animal sacrifice and things like that. But there were certain pieces of this binding contract, certain elements that were commonly present. So, first element that's common is the preamble. And in the preamble, that section gives the name of the suzerain, the name of the stronger party, and it's often very illustrious, and they may have very long names to highlight their power and their importance. And then we come to a historical prologue that gives the basis or the reason for the covenant. And often, what the suzerain has done in the past that makes them worthy of being the suzerain in the first place, that type of thing is talked about in the historical prologue. And then we come to stipulations where the suzerain, the stronger party, lays out what the vassal is supposed to do or what the vassal is supposed to give the suzerain in this covenant. And then there's a statement often of blessings and curses, where the blessings or the benefits that the vassal will have if they keep the covenant, those things are elaborated on. And keeping the covenant was often called loving the suzerain. And again, this often involved paying taxes, offering military service when required, these types of things. And then there were also curses and punishments named that they would face if they broke the covenant. And breaking the covenant was often referred to as hating the suzerain. And again, breaking the covenant could involve just ceasing to pay taxes, making another covenant with another suzerain or something like that. And then witnesses are often invoked to validate the contract. And in a covenant between different ancient nations, they typically would call on their gods as witnesses. And this was to further ensure that both sides are loyal to their end of the covenant. It's not just a treaty between human beings, the gods are involved in this as well. And then there's a statement about copies. And often there was a written statement that copies of this covenant were to be made and then deposited in the temple of each nation's god. The copies went into the temple of each nation's god. And so this adds to the idea that their gods are watching over this covenant and making sure that it is kept. And finally, these covenants often had in them a stipulation that the covenant was to be read every so often out loud for the vassal party to hear, to remind them of their obligations to the suzerain and also what would happen to them if they broke the covenant. So it was meant to remind them and encourage them, strengthen them to keep the covenant. So when we put all these pieces together, we have preamble, historical prologue or background, stipulations, blessings and curses, the witnesses, again, often the gods, statement of copies, and an agreement for regular reading of the covenant. So if the Israelites entered into a covenant with God at Mount Sinai, then we can probably expect some parallels to how people in that time make covenants. Now, those things don't necessarily have to be there, but it would make sense if they were. And sure enough, it really seems like they are. In Exodus chapter 20 and verse 2, we have a preamble, very short and sweet. It says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, or really just naming his name in the preamble. I am the Lord your God. All God has to do there is say his name. And then the second part that I read, the second part of Exodus 20, is really the historical prologue where it says what God has done. God has brought his people out of Egypt and out of slavery. And so this is the reason for the covenant. So while the preamble might normally be very long and illustrious, in God's case, he just has to say his name. And here he just has to say what he has done for the Israelites, this amazing event, bringing them out of slavery. And then immediately in the next verse, we get into stipulations. And notice the first one. There are to be no other gods before God. In other words, the Israelites can have no other suzerains before the Lord. And we also have blessings and curses in the law of Moses. And to sum up the blessings, basically, God will make their land fruitful and he will protect them if they keep the covenant. And the curses are basically that other nations will defeat them, the land will be unfruitful to them, and ultimately they will lose the land if they are unfaithful to the covenant. We also read about witnesses being invoked in the Mosaic law, but instead of God calling on other gods as witnesses, he in this situation calls upon his creation. He calls upon heaven and earth as witnesses. We also have a statement of copies. Moses comes down, as you likely remember, from Mount Sinai with 2 tablets of God's law. And we tend to picture, when we picture Moses with the 2 tablets, 5 commandments on one side, 5 commandments on the other. But it's more likely that 1 copy was made for Israel and 1 copy was for the Lord. So 2 copies that would be identical. Both tablets would be identical. But since there is only one God involved, both copies in this case are stored in the Ark of the Covenant. Instead of 1 copy going to one nation's God and another to another nation's God, they both go into the temple. We also have a statement about periodic reading. Every 7 years, the law was to be read before the people. And so periodically, they were supposed to remind themselves of this covenant that they have entered into. And so the elements of ancient Near Eastern covenants are present in God's covenant with the Israelites at Sinai. So we have a preamble with God giving his name, historical prologue, he's brought them out of Egypt, stipulations, what was expected of the Israelites in this covenant, statement of blessings and curses, witnesses, which are heaven and earth in this case, copies that are made, and they both go into the tabernacle and later the temple, and then a statement of periodic reading as well. So all these elements seem to be present. So as we wrap up this evening, of course, the law of Moses is large. It is a legal code for an entire nation to live by. And so there's a lot to it. But hopefully, just looking at these key elements of it that we looked at tonight will help us better understand how it functions in the story of the Old Testament. This is not just a legal code, it is a covenant. And the nature of the law of Moses as a covenant, that's going to be super important for the Old Testament's overall message. And all throughout the rest of the Old Testament, after Israel enters into this covenant with God, in some way or another, everything that happens is related to Israel's faithfulness or unfaithfulness to this covenant. And the Lord, unsurprisingly, is faithful to upholding his end of the covenant throughout the Old Testament. But the big issue is, how faithful will Israel be? And so to wrap up tonight, and also what we talked about last week, the Old Testament is essentially a story of redemption, and that story unfolds across several covenants. We have a covenant with Adam, with Noah, with Abraham, with Israel through Moses, and then with David. And then ultimately, redemption is going to come into its fullness through Jesus Christ, and we await the final redemption at Jesus' second coming. So thank you all. Thank you for joining us tonight. Next week, we're going to begin looking progressively at the Old Testament story, and we're going to note its theological themes along the way, and we're naturally going to begin at the beginning. So we're going to begin at creation, and I'm really looking forward to looking at that together next week. But thank you all. I hope you all are doing well. If this helps, if having me on the screen with my face, if that's helpful for you, please let me know, because I want to present these in the way that is most helpful for everyone. But I hope you all have a good rest of the week. Thank you.